Welcome to Tom's Place. Today we're going to be talking about Daniel Lanois, a guitarist, a pedal steel player, a drummer, a singer, a songwriter, an arranger, but most of all, a phenomenal producer. 3-time Grammy winner for Producer of the Year, Daniel Lanois, today at Tom's Place.
For as long as there's been rock and roll, Tom Wachkowski has been making music. A Juno-nominated producer, acclaimed singer-songwriter, and musician, Tom has performed from coast to coast to England and beyond. Half a century of making records, friends, and memories brings us here to Tom's Place.
Danny Lanois. Danny was born in Hull, Quebec in 1951. Daniel Lanois is a songwriter, a singer, a guitar player, pedal steel player, a drummer, but most of all, he's a world-renowned producer, and he's Canadian. Well, Daniel opened a small studio in his mother's house in Ancaster. I believe it was around 1970. Actually, the studio was his mom's laundry room. And he put it together with his brother Bob. And Bob would later on become quite a famous videographer who's done a lot of work with Danny over the years. And I believe the first machine that they got was an old Ampex 4-track. And they used to record local bands and charge them $60 a session. That's how they got started. You know, Danny and Bob, they regularly also aided their clients with arrangements and some of the songwriting. The word spread quite quickly about the Lanois brothers and what they had, and they started to decide that they needed a bigger place. So they got this old house in Hamilton, and it was on Grant Avenue, so they actually called it Grant Avenue Studios. And a buddy of mine, Graham Green, he had a studio not too far away from there with the keyboard player from Crowbar, Kelly J, and they had a place called Bad Manners. So there was the 2 studios happening there in Hamilton. And just on a personal note, in 1979 or late 78, whenever I opened Maxim Studios, I bought my MCI 2-inch machine from Danny out of the Grand Avenue. At that time they were upgrading or changing machines, I can't quite remember, but so that's on a personal note, my little connection with Danny. And it just sort of progressed from there. The next was meeting Brian Eno. You know, as Danny's reputation grew, he started getting jobs producing Ian Tyson and a children's artist by the name of Raffi, who had many big records. Also Martha and the Muffins, and for a long time it was kind of confused that my ex-wife, Martha Johnson, who was with me in the Folklords, they thought she was the lead singer for Martha and the Muffins. Different Martha Johnson. Just to set that record clear, and maybe Wikipedia can get it right now. And this would all change drastically for Daniel when he got that initial contact with Brian Eno. It would change not only the way he produced, it would literally change his life. Well, you know, I'm just going to get off subject here for a minute. I want to tell you folks a little bit about Brian Eno. I know not everybody's aware of him. Brian Eno started off in the late 60s with a band called Roxy Music, who were pretty progressive for the time in Britain, with a singer by the name of Brian Ferry. They had quite a collaboration. And then I think it was around 1971 Brian left the band and decided to pursue his quests for the sonics. Brian Eno was one of the early guys that really got heavy into synthesizers and mellotrons and all of that sort of stuff. And the first album, I remember seeing Brian Eno in Britain in, I think it was 1972, playing at the Marquee Club. And at that time he had just put out an album called Here Come Those Warm Jets. And this was sort of, to me, as I now sort of analyze what Danny Lanois has been doing over all of these years, that was sort of my introduction to what was to come between Brian and Danny. Well, you know, Daniel first worked with Brian Eno in the decade that would follow, like the late 70s. And he would emerge as Danny's mentor, chief collaborator. And together they spent a bunch of time experimenting with ambient sounds, experimenting heavily with sonic manipulation, techniques that Eno would eventually incorporate into the productions that he did with Danny. And then Brian decided to go back to Britain, and Danny stayed over here and did more productions locally. Daniel first worked with Brian Eno, I believe it was in the late 70s, around 1979, that Brian actually moved to Toronto and heard about Danny, and they got together. And together they spent a bunch of time then at Grant Avenue working on ambient sounds and you know, experimenting heavily with sonic manipulation techniques that Eno had already started to develop while he was in Britain. After a certain time, Brian decided to move back to England, and Danny stayed in Ontario, and he started producing people like the Parachute Club and Nash the Slash and Mama Quilla, and incorporating some of the techniques that he had worked together with Brian. Grant Avenue was it was growing. The productions were getting more frequent for Danny. More people were calling him up. And then in around late 1983-84, Danny got that call again from Brian Eno. And Brian said to him, "Come on over and co-produce an album with me. This band from Ireland called U2." So Danny went over. They produced the album Unforgettable Fire, which of course became a massive hit. And Peter Gabriel, who had been the original lead singer with Genesis and who had had a solo career happening at this point as well, invited Danny to produce the music for a film he had done called Birdie. And he was so impressed with that, he asked Danny to stay and produce his album So, which became an international smash album, and for which Danny Lanois won his first Grammy Award for Producer of the Year. I'd kind of like to mention that, you know, as the 80s progressed and recording was starting to change already. We were starting to see the phasing out of vinyl was starting to happen already, and the introduction of digital recording was already in its infancy. I mean, it had started well before this, but hadn't become mainstream yet. But, you know, Daniel stayed true to his beliefs and analog recording. And as a matter of fact, as the years progressed, this is something he never veered from very far at all. One of the albums that he ended up producing in 1987 was Robbie Robertson's first album. And in that album he you know, he used all his old techniques, the old microphones, the old analog equipment, incorporating. If you listen to that album, I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant album. He really has mastered the ambient and the sonics and the EQ. It's just an absolutely stunning piece of work. And again, kudos to Brian Eno for getting him into all of this. You know, I kind of like to mention that, you know, as the 80s progressed and recording was starting to change already. We were starting to see the phasing out of vinyl was starting to happen already, and the introduction of digital recording was already in its infancy. I mean, it had started well before this, but hadn't become mainstream yet. But, you know, Daniel stayed true to his beliefs and analog recording. And as a matter of fact, as the years progressed, this is something he never veered from very far at all. One of the albums that he ended up producing in 1987 was Robbie Robertson's first album. And in that album, he used all his old techniques, the old microphones, the old analog equipment, incorporating. If you listen to that album, I mean, it's a brilliant, brilliant album. He really has mastered the ambient and the sonics and the EQ. It's just an absolutely stunning piece of work. And again, kudos to Brian Eno for getting him into all of this.
Excellent. Just gotta reset the other camera.
La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. I'm going to fake a couple of little things here.
You do whatever you feel you need to do. Question 8. Take one.
You know,
Oops.
Danny.
Start again. Bump the camera. All right. Take 2.
You know, we could talk for hours about Danny's productions. The artists that he worked with, the awards that he won. I mean, he won 3 Grammys, and he was nominated another 4 times as Producer of the Year. That's 7 times. Think that through for a second. Who else has had that many awards for Producer of the Year? Greats like Joni Mitchell? 1. Greats like Phil Spector? None. Greats like George Martin? 2. Our boy Danny? 3. Anyway, I'd like to talk about a couple of the albums that really impressed me that Danny had produced. Like I say, I could talk about a lot of the albums, but one of the ones, he found this old mansion in downtown New Orleans, and this kind of, you know, it sort of rings true to me because of Danny's upbringing in Quebec and his love for Acadian music, which, by the way, he was writing songs all this time. He wasn't really putting anything out yet. He would put out his first album, Acadia, and he recorded it in this mansion in New Orleans. It was a beautiful old big roomy place with high ceilings and windows and all that. Noises from the street didn't matter, you know. He had the gear, and the first album that he recorded there that really impacted me was an album by Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan went down there and Bob Dylan had been in kind of a lull probably for a decade or so, and they recorded this album called Oh Mercy. And Danny incorporated some of the players from down in New Orleans, you know, guys from the Neville Brothers and so on, and they created this great album. That was in that mansion in New Orleans. And another one that he did down there was the Neville Brothers, and I'm probably one of the biggest fans of Aaron Neville and the Neville Brothers. And they recorded an album called Yellow Moon, which actually catapulted this group to international fame. And to this date, Danny still has this mansion down in New Orleans and still uses it time to time. But you know, he's not the first guy. I mean, I'm going to talk about other producers that have done the same sort of thing, like with Led Zeppelin and all kinds of different bands, where they've said, fuck the studio. Let's go in this old castle there. We're going to have so much fucking bouncing around off the walls that's going to drive us nuts. But you know what? We can get a sound. Well, you know, Daniel was not only a producer. On a lot of these records, I should mention, he also played guitar. That beautiful sort of background. Sometimes he would do solos, but the background things that added so much of the ambiance to his productions. And being aware of the sonic impact, besides what he was playing, listening, when I was listening to Willie Nelson's album Tetro, which was recorded in an old movie theater in Oxnard, California. Actually, what Danny did is he had, I think Brother Bob was down in New Orleans. He said, ship up the equipment. Ship it up. We'll hang some curtains. He just had a feel about this place. And they recorded Willie's album Tetro there. They also recorded Emmylou Harris's Wrecking Ball, for which he won another Grammy, by the way. And just, you know, he just had a feel for places, whether it was the house there, whether it was the laundry room in his mother's basement, or wherever else he recorded. He always had a feel for the room. He could feel, this will work for me. I know my equipment. Let's produce it. You know, I should have mentioned that while Danny was still in New Orleans, he did record his first album called Arcadia. And it sort of reminds me of Acadian folk mixed with a bit of French, mixed with a bit of New Orleans, and you stir it all together, and it was like Acadian gumbo. You know, today, a few times I've talked about sonic and ambient manipulation and so on. I should clarify that a little bit. Now, there's a lot of ways of doing this, and a lot of people have done it in different ways, but I think Danny took it to a higher level. A lot of times when you're talking about sonics, you're talking about the way you're manipulating reverbs and equalization. Certainly, he was doing analog, so he was using all of the classic old microphones, everything from the U47, 67, 87, the AKGs, the Sennheisers, whatever. He understood microphones because he was at it at an early time. And I should say again, he probably learned a lot from a chap that I learned a lot from, whose name was Jack Kirkpatrick, a fellow that owned Teletech. And Teletech was like a provider of, you know, studio gear and microphones and consoles and all that sort of stuff. Actually, it was Jack Kirkpatrick that turned me on to Danny Lanois and the MCI that I bought from Danny. But Jack also had a real sense. He started doing this in 1953. So he grew up with the industry and knew everything about every piece of equipment. When I was installing the stuff at Maxim, I thought, now what are we going to do? We have this beautiful API console we bought out of the record plant in New York. We had this nice MCI. We bought a brand new JH110. We had built this room on the Headley Westlake design. We had no external EQs whatsoever. The room was built tuned. And then when it came to hooking everything up and actually making it work, I called up Jack and I said, can you come up here and give us a clue as to what we should be doing? And he came up, and I remember him walking in with his backpack, and I said, what's in the backpack? And he says, lots of sandwiches. I'm going to have to stay here for some days. And you know, the guy stayed there, I believe, for 7-8 days. We would go home in the evening. He would stay there. He would be laying under the console, soldering, wiring. He brought us the speakers that really worked in our studio. You know, we sort of said, okay, whatever you think, you know, and we had the Altec Big Reds and we had the EV speakers as a reference home speaker, and then we had the Oratones. I mean, he made this place what it was. He also worked with Danny. He also explained to us about the different verbs that played reverbs and all this, about the lexicon prime times, and these are all the things that Danny used in his recordings and learning how to manipulate them. And of course, with Brian Eno's input as far as synthesizers, well, with synthesizers, all of a sudden, you know, in the Western world, we sing in semitones, right? La 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 la, so forth. In Eastern music, they actually sing in quarter tones. Well, once you got a synthesizer, there was no such thing, because you could slide from one note to the next note, and you could actually have 100, 1,000 variables between C and C sharp, because it's a soundscape, you know, it's a soundscape. And it's the same thing as when, I'm just going to skip around a bit here, when Tom Dowd, he was the first guy that sort of said, nah, you know, what's this rotary dial for volume? He's the first guy that came up with the fader. Said, hey, wouldn't this be a lot easier? And then of course you have two different kinds of faders. You have the fader that'll give you most of your gain by the time you get up to 3, and then very little beyond that. Now I forget, one is a Purdy and one is a logarithmic scale. You know, don't quote me on that. But the Penn and Gile faders, which you would have on the Neve or the API or whatever, when you went to 3, it was 30%. When you went to 6, it was 60%. When you went to 9, it was 90%. And that was a beautiful new tool in mixing that also sort of incorporated into the way Danny did his work. So the verbs, the microphones, the microphone placements, the room itself, and his vision. I kind of want to mention that, you know, we've shot a bunch of these shows now on various producers, and it's up to my partner in crime, Dan Ward, as to how any of these episodes are going to come out, which is going to come first, which is going to come second. All I want to say is, you know, like, watch these shows. Enjoy what we're saying to you here. We're trying to give you as much information, but also, more importantly than that, when we talk about a producer, do yourself a favor. Pull out a couple of their pieces of work and have a listen to them and try and relate to what we've talked about that particular producer. So today, I'm going to get you to pull out Bob Dylan's Oh Mercy, Willie Nelson's Tetro, Peter Gabriel's So, U2's Unforgettable Fire, or Joshua Tree, perhaps even Emmylou Harris's Wrecking Ball, or Neil Young's, I can't remember what his album is called, or anything that he did with Ron Sexsmith. Listen to Peter Gabriel.
I was down at the station waiting for the 6:30 to Tulsa, when along came a lady. She said, "Son, have you got $10? I'll take all the pain that you hold deep in your eyes." I said, "That sounds fine, but I'll have to decline, 'cause I don't even have a dime." But obviously, you must be some kind of professional savior.